GOP. Minority Leader Nancy Pelosi under fire from a lot of fellow Democrats downplaying this week's losses, as well as special election defeats earlier this year in Montana and Kansas. Take a listen.
By all accounts, if you're a Republican, this is not good news to you. One, it's a Pyrrhic victory, 4 Pyrrhic victories, because it shows where the vulnerability is on the Republican side as we come forward.
And joining the panel this week, Wall Street Journal columnist and deputy editor Dan Henninger, columnist Bill McGurn, editorial board member Mary Kissel, and assistant editorial page editor James Freeman. Dan, a lot of fun stuff to talk about here, but I love Nancy Pelosi saying it was a Pyrrhic victory. Oh, wait a minute. It was 4 Pyrrhic victories. Maybe you can have 1 Pyrrhic victory, but 4 Pyrrhic victories in a row? I mean, that's kind of hard to take.
Yeah, well, as the old saying goes, David, 4 more Pyrrhic victories like this, and we're undone. Why is Nancy Pelosi, a savvy politician, saying such ridiculous things? And I think the reason is because she has nothing else to offer. What they have been doing in all of these elections has been teeing it up as a national election, a referendum on Donald Trump. Right. And since the election, the Democrats, whether in Washington or anywhere else, have been running solely against Donald J. Trump. What we discovered in Georgia is that's not working. And the Democrats have to come up with something else. And at the moment, it is well known they don't have much of anything else in terms of substance or policy. Well, and Bill, the question is whether they need somebody else, in particular somebody other than Nancy Pelosi. Donald Trump is just having a field day, by the way. He came out with a tweet about Nancy Pelosi, kind of pleading with her to stay. Let's put up the tweet if we can, essentially saying, please I certainly hope the Democrats do not force Nancy P. out. That would be very bad for the Republican Party. And please let Crying Chucky stay. What do you think?
Well, look, if you set up the race as a special election, the arrogance of the Democrats, running a guy who didn't even live in the district and so forth, you're going to get Donald Trump gloating when he's vindicated. You know, he's going to have a lot of fun with this. Now, in fairness, I'd say Nancy Pelosi herself isn't the problem, and if you look at how they played her in the election, the Republicans, it was San Francisco values. So the problem I think the Democrats have is twofold. On the one hand, they have these very liberal values that are not the values of most America. America's a center-right country, so it doesn't play outside San Francisco. Second, what's their strategy? Resistance. It's just not a persuasive thing. I don't think there's anyone. Maybe, well, John Ossoff doesn't live in the 6th district. I was going to say whether there's anyone who cares about the Russian investigation or something of Trump. And if you look at if you take Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton and Nancy Pelosi out of the equation, the Democrats have lost 1,000 seats over the last.
It's extraordinary.
And that's not just because the Republicans are geniuses. It's because people say what you're offering doesn't.
But Mary, there is also the attack on the brand of Trump. They thought that was a winning thing, even though that brand, by the way, the Trump name has made billions of dollars for the Trump family over the years. It was part of the reason he was elected. But now some Democrats are having second thoughts about beating up on the brand itself. Democrat Tim Ryan, who we should mention is looking for Nancy Pelosi's job, came out with an interesting comment saying that essentially the Democratic Party is now more toxic than Donald Trump, to which you say?
To which I say, again, it's not just the brand, it's the ideas that are behind the brand. And essentially the Democratic Party is a party of coastal liberal elites. A third of the House delegation is from New York, California, and Massachusetts. And I'm waiting, personally, for the Democratic Party to rediscover its inner Bill Clinton. You know, the pragmatist, the guy who doesn't just resist, who's genial, who identifies with average Americans, who doesn't just want to spend money all the time, who could get on board with something like welfare reform or a pragmatic fix to Obamacare. I just don't see those people in the Democratic Party anymore. John Ossoff tried to go there late in the campaign in Georgia.
But nobody believed him.
Nobody believed him.
Well, where do they go? By the way, the 4 losses they've had, James, 2 of those candidates, the Democratic candidates, were on the left of the spectrum. 2 were trying to convince people they were moderates, so they don't succeed no matter which ideology they try to use.
Yeah, I think they do want to rebrand. They want a more moderate image, but they do have this challenge, and the reason Nancy Pelosi is still the leader and the public face is she is the greatest fundraiser in political history outside of presidential candidates. More than $500 million over the years, and she has pulled money out of cities like this and L.A. and San Francisco. So are they really going to turn away from that funding constituency more toward a voting constituency? And that's not an easy thing to do.
Well, Dan, one point is this may stop the obstructionism. At least the Democrats seem to realize that just being obstructionist, having no message, just being anti-Trump doesn't win elections.
Yeah, it might at the Senate level. I think they're pretty dug in over in the House. But at the Senate, you know, moving forward to the tax bill, it's possible that some of these Democrats that are on the bubble, like Manchin, West Virginia, Heidi Heitkamp, North Dakota, Joe Donnelly in Indiana, may decide that they have to move themselves a little bit more towards the center. The difficulty there is that the economy is strengthening. And if the Republicans do pass that tax bill, give another booster shot to the economy, the Democrats, unless we've been saying here the past 5 minutes, come up with something stronger, they could have a really difficult time in 2018.
Bill, very quickly, incentives matter, whether you're talking economics or politics, and the one incentive that politicians have above all others is getting reelected.
Right.
If they try obstructionism, it doesn't get them elected or reelected, they're going to turn to something else.
Yeah, although I think, look, something like 95% of guys get elected now. We've been so polarized that a lot of people are in semi-safe seats and so forth. And like Mrs. Pelosi, she doesn't have to change. You know, her seat is safe. It's just not going to play in Iowa. Look, they freaked out over a guy running in the mayoral primary who is pro-life in Omaha. I mean, this is not a party that's open to diversity.
Very interesting times. When we come back, as the GOP tries to push ahead with its agenda, Senate Republicans releasing their health care bill. Details coming next.
Republicans believe we have a responsibility to act, and we are, for our constituents, for our states, and for our country.
Senate Republicans released a much-anticipated discussion draft of their health care plan on Thursday, 7 weeks after the House passed their own plan to repeal and replace Obamacare. So what's inside the Senate's bill, and how does it differ from the House's version? Let's ask Tevi Troy. He is the president of the American Health Policy Institute and the former Deputy Secretary of Health and Human Services under President G.W. Bush. Tevi, first of all, how would it change Obamacare?
Yeah, David, thanks for having me on. You know, in contrast to Nancy Pelosi, as you're saying, what they want is not any Pyrrhic victory. They want an actual victory here. How this would change in contrast to Obamacare is that it would reduce taxes, it would reduce spending, it would reduce mandates, reduce the overall size of the deficit, and hopefully reduce premiums, thereby requiring people to subsidize, or requiring the government to subsidize less. So that's the overall big picture of the bill. Let's hope it works out once they sort through all the details.
One thing it would not reduce, and some of its critics have pointed to this, some of its conservative critics, is money for insurance companies. There's an extra $50 billion by my account over the next 5 years of help for insurers that are going to be forced to continue to pay for folks with pre-existing conditions, right?
Yeah, so I think you're talking about the stabilization fund. I think the fear is that the insurers will continue to exit the market as they've been doing in the Affordable Care Act. We just saw, I believe, Anthem exiting recently. So the problem is that the insurers are very nervous about these markets remaining stable, and so what they're putting this money in to make sure the insurers stay in the game for now.
Well, is it fair for critics, whether they're on the left or the right, to call this a bailout of insurers?
Well, you know, politics being politics, you're definitely going to get some of that. But I think the overall goal is if you can get these markets stabilized, then over time you won't need to provide any additional money for insurers, but they can get their money through premiums and that are reduced so that people are actually incentivized to purchase them on their own, again, without subsidies.
Now, the dirty little secret, of course, about Obamacare, among others, was the fact that Medicaid was used, an expanded version of Medicaid, to insure people who couldn't be insured directly within the Obamacare system. What's happening with Medicaid in the Senate bill?
Yeah, that's a really good point. There's a what you've had is a little bit of a game where you've had people in Medicaid and expanded Medicaid. The Senate bill kind of gets rid of that fiction. If you're in Medicaid as it is, and then other people are supposed to get tax credits to get them into the individual market. Also, the big changes in Medicaid are coming a little later, so there's a delay so that governors can deal with it. And also, you're having a little more experimentation by governors so that governors can be innovative in how to design the systems the way they see fit and not necessarily the way the federal government wants to do it.
Then there are also some things that are not that big in terms of money, but that have a lot of significance for social concerns, things like eliminating, at least for a year, the money for Planned Parenthood, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's only for 1 year, so I guess it's a symbolic victory for the pro-life caucus, but there's divisions within Republicans. And again, the game is to get to 50 Republican votes. They have no Democrats working with them, so they've got to make sure they get 50 Republicans on board. And I think the Planned Parenthood compromise is a way of getting the symbolic support that they want, but it's not necessarily going to change the game long-term for Planned Parenthood.
Well, the key political factor in what they want to do is lower premiums. That's the thing that hurts Americans most. In fact, premiums have gone up. Deductions actually in many cases have gone up more percentage-wise, but will this do anything to actually get premiums and deductions down?
The theory is that it will. We have some evidence in that the CMS actuary, which is part of HHS but a non-political part of HHS, scored the House bill, which was similar but not the same, and it said that it would reduce the gross size of premiums, reduce the amount of premiums. And so that is a good thing. And again, if you reduce premiums, you don't have to subsidize as much. But, you know, you never know how these things are going to play out until the legislation is actually written, signed by the president, and then implemented.
There's another thing. This is a bugaboo of mine, since a lot of doctors tell me that they're thinking of quitting being doctors because of it. The malpractice laws are so generous in this country. Of course, England has ways to prevent that, loser pays and stuff that maybe wouldn't be a part of this. But anything in this Senate bill that would adjust frivolous lawsuits brought as malpractice suits?
So you're talking about malpractice reform, which is a part of the Republican plank overall. It is not something that they could get in this bill because of the 60-vote threshold. It's not something that would fit in with the so-called budget reconciliation rules, or as I call them, the budget reconciliation limitations. So that is something that I think Republicans are going to continue to pursue, but it is a very heavy lift, as the trial lawyers are a big funder of the Democratic Party, and so they're not going to give up on that easily.
Democratic and Republican. They own the Beltway, let's be honest about it. I mean, it's a tough haul. All right, selling insurance across state lines. Now, on the House side, they said this is going to have to wait for another version of an Obamacare cleanup before we get it done. Does the Senate address this at all?
It's the same problem here, David. It is the budget reconciliation limitations that don't allow them to do something that is not within the budget context. So that's not going to be in there. However, I think that's something that could be attached to a piece of legislation down the road, let's say a must-pass piece of legislation, and then you could put it up for a vote and see if you can get it that way. So I think that I think the Journal editorial said that this is not a free market utopia, but I think it's a step, and then they could do additional steps down the road, given the regulatory powers they have, and trying to do one-off rifle shot legislation.
So this is not the end, but it's the beginning of the end, right?
Or perhaps the end of the beginning, as Churchill said.
Right. Tevi Troy, great to see you. Thank you very much for coming in. Appreciate it. When we come back, Republicans are facing a long, hot summer as they try to deliver on some key campaign promises. So from the health care overhaul to comprehensive tax reform, can they count on members of their own party to move their agenda forward?
It's not enough just to pass a bill that has Obamacare repeal in the title. We've got to actually have legislation that fixes the underlying problem.
I didn't run on replacing it with more government programs. I didn't run on allowing the death spiral of Obamacare to continue just to subsidize it with taxpayer money. I think we can do better than this, and my hope is not to defeat the bill, but to make the bill better.
That was Kentucky Senator Rand Paul, just one of the Republicans opposing the health care plan that was released this week. So as the GOP tries to move forward this summer on two campaign promises, repealing and replacing Obamacare and overhauling the tax system, can they count on support from their own members? We are back with Dan Henninger, Bill McGurn, Mary Kissel, and James Friedman. Mary, it's not going to be a slam dunk.
Well, it's a do-or-die moment for the Republican Party. Either they're going to repeal and replace Obamacare with something better, or they're going to have to prop up Obamacare because the exchanges are failing, and politically you just cannot afford to have millions of people in America without access to insurance. And look, Donald Trump is going to do a deal. If he doesn't do a deal with the right, he's going to do a deal with the left. And health care is going to be key to the tax reform.
Well, and Bill, the president has already begun to sell this plan, and he's talking nice about some of his Republican critics, which he hasn't always done. Let's just play a little snippet of an interview he had on Fox and Friends on Friday.
There are also 4 good guys and they're 4 friends of mine, and I think that they'll probably get there. We'll have to see, but I think we're going to get there. We have 4 very good people that, it's not that they're opposed, they'd like to get certain changes, and we'll see if we can take care of that.
We're going to take care of that. We can make a deal.
Right. Look, he's the guy that's the deal maker, and you don't get a deal by trashing the people that you want to persuade to support you. I think Republicans have to realize this is an Irish choice. Not perfect versus something that's probably going to be a lot worse. Like the alternative to this is not a better bill.
Right.
It's nothing. Yep. And I think that relates to the elections later. You know, we talk about the symbolism of the politics of the moments of. At the end of the day, the Republican fortunes are going to be made on whether ordinary people who are now struggling in this economy feel more opportunity and better about the future. And that means lower premiums for a lot of people, and it means tax cuts, you know, that help revive the economy. And that's the reality. It's not just the legislation. We need to do something to do this. And I hope President Trump realizes that this legislation is not just something Congress is doing. At the end of the day, he's going to be judged by this, by whether he can produce.
James, Bill just talked about taxes. Paul Ryan came out this week and talked about, you know, really pushing forward on taxes in a way that, frankly, I haven't heard from anybody except people in the Trump administration. That was great to hear. He did not mention the border tax. Did they finally wake up to the fact that people don't want another tax?
Yeah, well, I think they are waking up to the idea that they're going to junk this beltway custom that if you're going to cut some taxes, you have to raise other taxes over here. And I think that's what you're hearing from Paul Ryan from the Freedom Caucus, not just tax reform, but tax cuts. And I think that ought to be their focus. If he's able
not creating a whole new tax that didn't exist before, like the border tax.
Right. And I think they have to focus on their political futures. We've been talking about what these special elections mean, what's going to happen next year. They have got to get the economic reform, the economic revival program going if they want to get reelected next year, if they want to keep control of the Congress, and that starts with a big tax cut.
And Dan, it is across the board. Paul Ryan was saying it's going to be corporate. It's also going to be individual. He mentioned the fact that 8 of 10 companies in America are not incorporated. They pay taxes as individuals. So it's a real sort of Reagan-esque across-the-board tax plan.
Yeah, it's across the board, and they're trying to extend it out as far as they can. And, you know, we have to point out that in this health care bill, they have taken a start. They have eliminated Obamacare's taxes. They also eliminated the 3.8% surcharge on investment income for higher income people. That will help the economy. So I think between the two bills, they are headed in the right direction. And I have to say, Senator Rand Paul, it sounds like a man from Mars, as though he wants to just start all over again, that there's no Congress to deal with. They have got an opportunity here to show that they can get something done. If they don't, the Democrats are sitting there with universal health care, which they will propose immediately.
Right. But, Mary, interestingly, there are some Democrats, we used to call them blue dogs, the more moderate Democrats, who this week announced that they were meeting with the Trump team. In fact, they met with Treasury Secretary Mnuchin and some other members on tax cuts. So is it conceivable, particularly in light of that Georgia election, that they may get some Democrats coming to their side?
Well, I would hope so. What has been lacking is, of course, bipartisanship, and it's not on the Republican side. I think the Republicans are very happy to do deals with Democrats. For instance, on the tax plan, getting tax cuts in exchange for more infrastructure spending. spending. Look,
there's a deal.
Democrats want to get reelected. They're not going to get reelected on the platform of Barack Obama. We've seen that in the last several races. There's an opportunity here for them to step forward and to say, look, we want to have policy victories to take home to our voters, too, to run on next year.
Very quickly, Bill, I think it's likely that they're going to get some Democrats on taxes, but it doesn't seem that they'll get any on health care, right?
Probably not. Look, to me, this is a scene from On the Waterfront with Marlon Brando and Carl Malden. You know the scene where Marlon Brando's all upset and he wants to shoot the gangster, and Carl Malden says, "You want to get even? You really want to get even? Testify in court." That's what they have to do to President Trump. This is key, not just to the Republicans in Congress, but to the president. If he wants to get even, stop worrying about Russia, stop worrying about James Comey. Get these two bills through, and they can't touch them.
Well, Russia's not getting Democrats anywhere these days, so maybe he's won on that one. Still ahead, tensions between former Cold War rivals are heating up, with Russia saying they're going to target U.S. planes in Syria. Former UN Ambassador John Bolton joining us next. The long-simmering tensions between the U.S. and Russia erupting this week following the American military's downing of a Syrian warplane. Moscow is now threatening to target aircraft flown by the U.S. and its allies west of the Euphrates River. John Bolton is the former U.S. ambassador to the United Nations and a Fox News contributor. First of all, Ambassador, what happened to the narrative of the Trump administration and Russia being hand in glove?
Well, I don't think it ever was hand in glove. I think Vladimir Putin pursues with absolute clarity what he sees as Russian national interest, and the only appropriate American response to that is to do the same on our side. And right now, I think in the context of the war against ISIS and the region more broadly, I think the Defense Department, the State Department are still basically on autopilot from the Obama administration. There is not a new administration strategy, and we need one, not one that's dictated by the tactics of Russian or American planes in the sky over the region, but by a notion of how we want to defeat ISIS and what's going to come after it.
Well, ISIS, as I mentioned, Russia now created this new rule that no U.S. or NATO planes can fly south of the Euphrates. That's essentially Assad territory, the guy who controls Syria, who they're allied with. Is it possible? Can we just stay north of the Euphrates and avoid any conflict with Russia?
It's not for Russia to tell us where to fly.
Absolutely.
And this is one of the legacies of Barack Obama. He allowed a Russian air base to be built at Latakia. John Kerry famously said when asked, what's that base for? He said, oh, for force protection. What, to protect the Russian forces that ought to be in Russia and not Syria? We're not looking for military action, let's be clear. But I think we want to build up an American presence that says to the Russians, we will fly where we want to fly. And the people you ought to worry about deconflicting are Syrian and Russian pilots. But again, this has to be a piece of a larger post-ISIS strategy to prevent Russia's key allies, the Assad regime in Syria and the Iranians, from building an arc of control through the Baghdad government in Iraq, through Assad's control in Syria and Hezbollah in Lebanon, to set the stage for the next conflict in the region. I'm afraid that's where they're going. I don't think we have a response.
Well, we have taken out a Syrian plane in air. We don't know what happened to the pilot. We've taken out many planes on the ground when they use chemical weapons. What happens if somehow a Russian gets in the mix and there's a Russian death? What happens between our two nations?
Well, again, we're not looking for it, but rule number one is we will protect American forces. We will protect them against the Syrian military, against Syrian planes, Syrian drones, or anybody else's planes or drones that we deem threatening to them. But to me, this is one argument why we've got to have a better understanding of what exactly are the forces we're using to help destroy ISIS. The Kurds, yes, some have their own trouble, but by and large the Kurds are with us. I think helping the Baghdad government is equivalent, sad to say, to helping the Ayatollahs in Iran. I think we need more Arab forces from the Gulf states, from Egypt, from Jordan, less reliance on some of these dubious Syrian groups. But that strategy has not yet emerged from state or defense.
By the way, it's not just in the Middle East. There was this confrontation over the Baltic Sea in which a Russian fighter jet came within 5 feet of a U.S. plane. I mean, that's pretty damn close.
It's extraordinarily dangerous, and they've done this in numerous instances, both with respect to planes and our ships in the Baltic. The Russians are still pushing forward. Let's not mistake Vladimir Putin here for somebody warm and fuzzy. He's tough as iron. He's totally cynical. He's still pushing to see how far he can get, and as of yet, he's still to see any material pushback from the administration.
All right. Meanwhile, the shakeup in the Middle East, a kind of a realignment, continues with the Saudi king appointing his 31-year-old son as the crown prince, kind of kicking out an older guy, a cousin that was in there before. I'm just wondering, any connection between the Trump visit a few weeks ago and this move?
Well, it's possible, but I think this has also been in the making for a while. I have to say, I am worried about it, not because I disagree with the modernizing agenda of the king and the new crown prince. There's a lot to be said for what they want to do, but the balance of power within the extraordinarily large Saudi royal family has been negotiated out for a long period of time. I don't think we've seen the end of this succession struggle, and while I certainly welcome modernization in Saudi Arabia, let's be clear, the Salafist clerics, the Wahhabis still hold enormous power, and I very much fear that if the modernization is not done carefully, we're going to face a Shah of Iran situation in Saudi Arabia, and to see that project collapse and a religious extremist regime take power, which would wreak havoc with the global economy.
I want to put a little more optimistic spin on this, and maybe it's not political spin, but the fact is that the realignment does bring together former enemies. I mean, Israel and Saudi Arabia have never been closer because they have this common enemy of Iran. And, of course, the United States is much stronger in the mix, not only because of what we did, what we proved we would do in Syria, but because of our commitment to our Arab allies in the Middle East. So this realignment could be the beginning of something extremely positive, no?
Well, if it continues, you know, there's nothing like a religious extremist with nuclear weapons to concentrate your attention in Saudi, in the other members of the Gulf Cooperation Council, in Israel. But if the Saudi regime, through personal ambition or family ambition, ends up destabilizing, everybody in the Gulf on the Arab side could be in trouble, and the opportunity for both Sunni extremists and the Ayatollahs in Tehran could be formidable.
You know, I tried to give you an out so that you could end on a positive note. You didn't take it, but Ambassador, it's good to see you anyway. Thank you very much for coming in. Appreciate it.
Thank you, David.
Well, still ahead, the horrific death of Otto Warmbier, just the latest reminder of North Korea's brutal ways. So what's the next step in reining in that rogue regime? And can we count on China at all to help?
You look at North Korea, what's going, look at Otto, beautiful Otto. Went over there a healthy, wonderful boy. And you see how he came back. You see how he came back. So we've been given a bad hand, but we're going to take that bad hand, and it'll all be good.
President Trump reacting this week to the tragic death of Otto Warmbier, the 22-year-old student who was held in a North Korean prison for 17 months, died on Monday, just less than a week after he was released and returned home to Cincinnati. Just the latest reminder of the brutal nature of that rogue regime and the urgent need to stop its nuclear ambitions. So can the Trump administration count on China for help? We're back with Dan Henninger, Mary Kissel, and Bill McGurn. Mary, first of all, the focus on Otto Warmbier. Sometimes when you focus on one American who's been terribly mistreated as he was to the point of death, it's personal. We got to know the family. We got to know Otto. We were pulling for him to pull through, which, of course, he didn't. The significance of that?
Well, North Korea is a closed regime, and foreign journalists who go to North Korea are not allowed to go very deeply into the country. So we're not really shown the reality of what life is like in North Korea today. What happened to Otto is happening to tens of thousands of North Koreans. And, you know, you said in your introduction, David, that we have to stop their nuclear ambitions. Let's remember, too, that they're working on biological, chemical weapons. We saw the chemical weapon used in Kuala Lumpur to kill Kim's brother. And look, they have the delivery systems now, too. They're working on ballistic missile programs. They could take balloons and send them over Seoul and drop chemical weapons all over Seoul. This death shows the kind of individual, the kind of regime that wants those weapons.
And you can't negotiate with these people. I mean, Otto Warmbier's father, Bill, was very clear about the fact, I mean, he pulled no punches in saying that he had no respect for the Obama method of dealing with him with kid gloves on. I mean, it was only when Trump got tough with him that they got any kind of work.
I'd say 2 points. One is absolutely right. This is more than an individual tragedy. It also illustrates the world is a more dangerous place when regimes like this think they can molest Americans. I mean, you look at the countries like Iran taking hostages and they release them and take more. It's not a coincidence that the most belligerent guy in Asia is a guy that would brutalize American citizens. Second, Donald Trump also had a statement about China not being helpful. And a friend of mine, Mark Simon from Hong Kong, suggests, you know what might be a good measure for China? Revoke the student visas for all those children of Chinese leaders coming to the United States. That might get their attention.
Dan, the president did take this very personally, as we all did, as I think all Americans did. When he takes things personally, he does act on them. So the chance is there will be some change in our relation with China, no?
Well, you just showed his meeting with President Xi of China, and he tweeted earlier this week that it hasn't worked out in getting China to help with North Korea. The next day, however, Defense Secretary Jim Mattis and Secretary of State Rex Tillerson said, we are still working the problem. What they mean by that is they're working on imposing sanctions on about 10 companies, Chinese companies,